Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Herbert David. I'm one of the co-directors of the Center for Uncertainty Studies here, and also on behalf of the other two co-directors sitting here, Silke Schwand and Andreas Zick. We are really excited and glad to have Ian Scoones here today as a speaker. So as some of you might know, for some time, we have been developing some research agenda around modes of navigating uncertainty. And we were having some talks. We were introducing these uncertainty talks, where this is one of them. And so at some point, we realized, oh, there is actually a new book called Navigating Uncertainty, which is really interesting, you could say coincidence, but of course it's not a coincidence, but it's because it seems the topic is just something which is on the agenda. And going through the book, we realized, I mean, you can find some copies of the book outside, by the way, and also let me say you can buy it. There is a discount of 20% on it, but I just learned you can also download it for free, which of course is highly recommended. So it's a really fascinating book, and it goes, as we will hear later, through all different fields and then dealing with the way uncertainty is navigated. And some of these ideas really scarily sound familiar to us because we had kind of similar ideas, but here it's really extremely nicely presented and developed and so on. So it's fantastic to have Ian Scoones here. So let me say just two words about this very impressive vitae. So Ian is a professorial fellow at the University of Sussex. Affiliated with the Institute of Development Studies. He has worked on many areas, actually too many for me even to list all of them. But my understanding is a lot of the work, and maybe your main work, at least initially in the career, was on pastoral development and doing a lot of field work also in African countries. And I think this also influences a lot the perspective on how to deal with uncertainty. Um, and so Ian has written many books, many papers. Currently, he holds an ERC Advanced Grant on topics related to this. Is super highly cited, so I'm not going to go through all the details, but I highly recommend to look at many of these papers. I see some economists here. There's actually 2024 paper on uncertainty in economics, which maybe you want to check out. So without further ado, I hand over to Ian and very much looking forward to your presentation.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And it's wonderful to be here. I've never been to Bielefeld University or Bielefeld itself, so it's great to be here, and particularly in a Center for Uncertainty Studies. I mean, I've been working away on thinking about uncertainty for many, many years, but I had no idea there was an actual center. So it's wonderful to come and share some of the thoughts from this book with you. So in this presentation, I want to make a quite simple argument that if we put uncertainty at the center of our thinking and practice, this means in many ways a quite fundamental rethinking of society, economy, politics as we know it. And with this, ideas about sustainability and conflict and so on. And as I'll show, for a variety of reasons, we're stuck in a rather linear, mechanistic, technocratic, and risk-based paradigm that fails too often to address the dynamic complexity of today's turbulent world. This, I argue in the book, is problematic, but actually also sometimes actually dangerous. So I want to draw on this book that came out in August with Polity Books, with this title here, Navigating Uncertainty, Radical Rethinking for a Turbulent World. Helga Novotny wrote in her book about uncertainty, such uncertainties are written in, she said, to the script of life. And I thought that was a really nice encapsulation, because uncertainty is everywhere. It's with us in our being, in our thinking, in our practice. Bruno Latour equally argued the world is not a solid continent of facts, somehow sprinkled by a few lakes of uncertainties, but a vast ocean of uncertainties, speckled by a few islands of calibrated and stabilized forms. So what if the world is dominated by uncertainty and complexity, not risk and stability? What if the modernist systems of formalized planning, of risk management, of control systems, and so on, just don't work? So I'm going to argue that this is the case, but I'm also going to argue that not all is lost, that there are some people who have long grappled with uncertainty that we can all learn from and refashion the way we think about our societies, economies, and politics. So my reflections on navigating uncertainty are based in part on, sadly now recently completed ERC Advanced Grant, which was called PASTRES, Pastoralism, Uncertainty, Resilience, and crucially in the subtitle, Global Lessons from the Margins. And over 6 years, we explored, together with PhD students and others, how pastoralists, mobile, extensive livestock keepers, have been navigating uncertainties in a whole range of different sites that you can see on this map. 3 continents, 6 countries. And in the book, these experiences are very much drawn upon, but also draw on other research by myself and other colleagues, from small-scale farming in Zimbabwe, where I've worked for a very long time, from farmers and fishers in the Sundarbans Delta, and indeed control room engineers and technicians in California, bankers in London and New York, food consumers in Brazil and India, and frontline health workers in both the UK and Southern Africa. So a very diverse array of people who you wouldn't think should come together in one book, but I'll try and explain why that's the case. The argument overall is that learning from those who must navigate uncertainties continuously, whether it's climate, markets, disease, conflicts, political conditions, and so on, can help us in confronting uncertainties. So a core framework from the book comes from my colleague Andy Sterling, who's based at the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex. And this simple diagram was originally published in the 1990s. We developed it further within the context of the STEP Centre that Andy and I co-directed for a long time, between 2006 and 2021. Because uncertainty for us was very much central to thinking about the politics of sustainability, which is what the centre was about. So the framework, as you can see, explores 2 axes: knowledge about likelihoods of outcomes and knowledge about outcomes themselves. So it therefore results in 4 dimensions of incertitude. Crucially, these dimensions are conditions of knowledge, not simply fixed of nature. So risk, top left-hand corner, is where the probabilities of both outcomes and their likelihoods are known or can be predicted. Uncertainty, though, is where likelihoods are unknown, but we might know more or less the potential outcomes. Ambiguities are where outcomes are contested, where, for example, questions of fairness, of justice, of distribution, who wins, who loses, whose values count, come to the fore. And finally, there's ignorance, where we don't know what we don't know. So conditions of uncertainty, ambiguity, and indeed ignorance, not risk, are, I would submit, by far the most common situations we encounter, both in policy, in practice, and indeed in everyday life. And they're not amenable to simple risk management, the top left-hand corner. The problem is that most approaches that we use in policy and in many practices, which we'll come to, close down to risk, close down to that top left-hand corner, hence these arrows. This is conditioned by politics, by power, by processes of justification and professionalization, and these are all employed by those in power and those who seek to exert control. This is what Michel Foucault, of course, called governmentalities. Now, the examples on this slide are from pastoral development and drought responses, but you could choose any other area you like, and you'd find a similar pattern. Plans, models, insurance products, goals, targets, metrics, indicators, all seek somehow closure, pushing us often dangerously into these zones where knowledge and outcomes are assumed to be known, or at least thought to be able to be estimated, predicted, and calculated. So in the chapters of the book, I look at how closing down to risk, that top left-hand corner, and opening up to different forms of uncertainty occur across a number of themes. And I explore the implications for policy and practice in different domains, which you can see here. In each chapter, I look at very contrasting cases to try and draw out some of the principles and practices from all over the world. This is not just a story about poor people in marginalized places or rich people in privileged places. This is stories that are repeated again and again right across the spectrum of experience. Now, I can't summarize all the arguments in full. You'll have to read the book or download it, or indeed buy it, you never know. But let me give you a very rapid tour of the flavor of each of the 6 thematic chapters, which we can discuss in more depth later. First, there's a chapter on finance and banking, and I look in particular at the 2007-8 financial crash and how particular models, notably the Black-Scholes-Merton equation and regulatory practices, the various Basel Accords, created through risk management and risk analysis, to some extent, a false sense of security, when in fact, actually, uncertainty and indeed ignorance prevailed. The then Bank of England chief economist, Andy Haldane, commented back in 2009, very soon after the crash, processes of securitization resulted in the network becoming complex, dense, and opaque, with diversification generating heightened system-wide uncertainty. The result, he explained, was the crash. The crisis was rooted in what he called an exaggerated sense of knowledge and control. That things weren't quite as bad as they could have been, they were pretty bad, was often put down to how traders and others in the financial network were themselves able to navigate uncertainty. And that's been explored by many sociologists and anthropologists embedded in financial institutions in different parts of the world. They were able to, through a variety of practices, navigate compounding and cascading uncertainties in real time. It was, I argue, in this chapter, the human touch, the socialized networks that existed amongst traders and financiers that were important for learning, adaptation, and response. Not wholly successful, for sure, but important nevertheless. Then, equally in the chapter, I shift to a very different set of experiences, but also around markets. And actually, intriguingly, they have very similar characteristics. They're global, they're highly connected, they have rapid transactions, they're reliant on informal and tacit knowledge. These are livestock markets in the Horn of Africa, Western India, Southern Europe, and elsewhere. And I ask, how did they retain reliability? Well, intriguingly, the answer is the same. A socially embedded network which can respond to uncertainties and steer away from ignorance. In sum, understanding the social basis of markets and financial systems is absolutely crucial if we are to avoid the real dangers of closing down to risk and instead embrace uncertainties. The next chapter looks at technologies and regulation. And the regulation of new technologies always throws up these questions of what is safe for whom. This chapter looks at a whole array of different technologies, artificial intelligence, driverless cars, energy systems, and so on. But it focuses in particular on that big debate in the end of the 1990s and early 2000s around genetically modified crops that rumbles on today. But back then I worked on it quite intensively in different parts of the world. It explores how attempts to close down to risk through so-called science-based approach acted in many ways to exclude a whole variety of different public concerns, centered on uncertainties about impacts on health, on biodiversity, wider questions of the control of the food system, and so on. So by looking at policy responses and regulatory policy responses in particular in different countries, from the UK to the US to India, South Africa, and Brazil, we can see that a focus on regulatory policy cultures highlights how professional, institutional, and cultural perspectives get incorporated into how systems respond to uncertainty. There's not just one form of response. So take, for example, the classic difference between the European Union and its precautionary principles against a more industry-led legalistic approach focused on equivalence of products in the US. What we see, though, again and again and again, no matter what technology and what setting, is that a simple risk-based science approach, so-called, is clearly inadequate, along with the parallel, a narrow legalistic approach for regulatory control. Instead, policy must make public involvement and deliberation about uncertainty central, whether that's about upstream science or downstream implementation and policy decisions. The next chapter looks at critical infrastructures and the role of reliability professionals. So what are critical infrastructures? These are infrastructures that deliver important goods and services to society in the faces of high levels of variability. Think water systems, electricity supply systems, or food producing systems. The key question in such settings is, how do the goods and services, whether that's electricity or water or food, get delivered reliably, and who's involved? So in this chapter, I take the example, very contrasting again, of the electricity supply system in California, studied by colleagues Emery Rowe and others based at Berkeley, and a pastoral system again in northern Kenya that must respond continuously to droughts, diseases, floods, conflicts, and so on. What is interesting, once again, is that both operate in quite similar ways. Both rely heavily on what are called reliability professionals. These are people who can respond both to the immediate day-to-day challenges that variability gives rise to, and have understandings of the wider system and intelligence about it. So tracking between these modes is essential, and it's essentially how, as explained in the chapter, the lights are kept on in California and the herds kept alive, at least most of the time, in Kenya. Such professionals in any complex infrastructure operate necessarily in networks, not alone. They link different people across the system. In both cases, their role is usually massively underappreciated. But to respond to uncertainty and avoid the dangers of ignorance and surprise, I conclude such professionals and their networks are vital and need to be central in our rethinking of the management of infrastructure. Fourth, as we all now know, pandemics are an important source of uncertainty. They're not going away. The experience of COVID-19 is on the back of a long run of different types of pandemic outbreak, whether SARS, avian flu, Ebola, all are looked at in this chapter. How to respond and prepare for pandemics is obviously a massive top policy priority right now. But the problem is the standard response to this is to continue to rely on often quite simplistic epidemiological models based on prediction and management, which are then linked to a technological response. Nothing wrong with those, but they don't necessarily combine, as I'll mention in a minute, with what's actually necessary to respond to uncertainty. Of course, pandemics are uncertain, as we found out during the COVID-19 pandemic, and modelling was important. And I look in this chapter at modelling experiences in the UK in particular, in a number of different public health schools, and how models were developed and the assumptions that went into them, and so on. But then I move to where COVID-19 was being experienced on the front lines, both in the UK Midlands and in southern Zimbabwe, where I have worked extensively. The chapter highlights, again, this disconnect between attempts at prediction and calculative control, mistakenly as it happened, focusing initially on influenza models and data, at least in the UK, and the day-to-day interaction with disease and its implications. And these implications are affected by class, by ethnicity, by location, by livelihood, by gender, by age, by context, in other words. But it's through these experiences that an argument is developed for a very different approach to pandemic preparedness and response. Not ditching epidemiological models and technologies for sure, but less reliant on centralized control and on the models and tech interventions to guide that, and more on an appreciation of multiple knowledges and the direct lived experiences of those on the front lines and living day to day with the disease. A similar argument is pursued in the next chapter, which looks at disasters. Earthquakes, floods, droughts, and so on seem to just dominate the headlines these days, and there's a huge industry on disaster risk reduction and response. The UN Sendai framework encapsulates much of this, and it's largely focused again on managing risk and improving prediction rather than navigating uncertainty. So this chapter moves from these UN discussions and then looks at how people manage drought, in this case, on the ground. And I focus on pastoralists in southern Ethiopia. What we find is that the externally imposed technological and financial systems, early warning systems, anticipatory action projects, risk management, de-risking through livestock insurance, for example, are just often not trusted and frequently fail to integrate with the local experiences of multiple intersecting uncertainties. Local responses to unfolding uncertainties, not necessarily understood by local people as a single crisis or a singular disaster, involve local capacities rooted in moral economies, in forms of collective solidarity, in social networks, in what one might call vernacular forms of resilience building. But again, this is not an argument for letting go of expertise and technology and assuming that local people can manage on their own. Too often they can't, and disasters overwhelm local capacities to navigate uncertainties, sometimes resulting in negative coping strategies and maladaptation. But instead of imposing solutions, working with what people already do, supporting existing networks and augmenting possibilities is a much more viable way forward, I argue, suggesting a very different approach to disaster preparedness and response. And these themes are then echoed in the final thematic chapter on climate change, perhaps the biggest challenge facing us all. So we know that climate change is happening, for sure, but it's uncertain how the impacts will play out, to what extent, where, affecting whom. And again, I look at the way models and how they act to mutually construct a particular global policy response often ignore the particularities of the challenges on the ground. So once again, this chapter moves from the big global processes, the IPCC, the COPs, to where modelers are trying to develop scenarios and understand climate uncertainties and risks in the UK Met Office and the collaborative approaches to global circulation modelling that are ongoing. And moving from those to the front lines of climate change, in this case, the Sundarbans of India and Bangladesh, and the dryland farming areas of Zimbabwe. It's here, in these settings, where responses to climate change have to contend with uncertainties. They cannot just live with the risks that are predicted through the models. Even the downscaled models, better as they are these days, are no use day to day for these people. Zimbabwean farmers, Indian Delta dwellers know full well climate change is happening, but they need to adapt and survive and respond in ways that have to run with the flow of uncertain lives and livelihoods. So following Sheila Jasanoff, who's based at Harvard, an STS scholar, the chapter asks, how at the level of community, polity, space, and time will scientists' impersonal knowledge of the climate be synchronized with the mundane rhythms of lived lives and the specificities of human experience? A global consensus on the meaning and urgency of climate change cannot arise on the basis of expert consensus alone, a theme that's relevant to all the chapters indeed. So to tackle climate change effectively, there needs to be much greater commitment to what Sheila calls co-construction, where modelers and local people interact, developing both mitigation and adaptation options simultaneously, challenging and reconstructing knowledge and social political orders at the same time. So, brief overview of each of those chapters, very brief. You'll have to delve into them in the book to get more of the case material and more of the nuance, but I've tried to give a very brief overview of some of the case study material, purposely chosen from very diverse settings and very diverse themes. Because as you can see, across all of these themes and across all these settings, the argument is made that a conventional risk-based paradigm, or control-based paradigm, if you like, is insufficient, and that we need to move increasingly to one centered on uncertainty, or care, as I term it. Now, I won't go into all the details of this table, but you can see some of the contrasts in the whole array of different policy domains, whether we're talking about public administration, legal frameworks, wider governance, resource management, and so on and so forth. But what I've indicated also is that we see from across these chapters, there are many different people, whether they're electricity supply engineers in California, pastoralists in Kenya, Ethiopia or China, people managing disease on the front lines in Zimbabwe and the UK, small-scale farmers and fishers in India and Southern Africa, and many more, all of whom are, to greater and lesser extents, navigating uncertainty. Now, the conditions through which uncertainties arise are deeply affected by contrasting histories. I'm not saying everyone's experience is the same, far from it. Experiences of colonialism, of policy cultures, and so on, all affect the way uncertainties can be managed. And indeed, different people have different vulnerabilities, and their ability to manage uncertainty is affected by their wealth, their positionality, their connections, and so on. But despite all of this, and despite these very different contexts, quite similar challenges are faced. And in each case, we observe a contrast between closing down to risk, often through calculative modeling approaches, the top left-hand corner, as against an opening up to uncertainty through much more open forms of modeling, flexible learning approaches, adaptation in the everyday. So I argue in the book that it's actually a universal challenge, even if there are very particular experiences and need to be quite particular solutions. So what does this mean for a wider politics of uncertainty? So politics of risk, as we've seen, are centered on what I've repeatedly said, calculative, technocratic, control-based responses, where we assume we can predict, we can model, we can manage. Such politics, interestingly, are quite similar, both under state-directed, top-down, dirigiste forms of politics, and under neoliberalism, where it's focused on individualized, marketized responses. Both those types of politics, if you like, often exclude social relations, forms of solidarity, forms of collective response in a decentralized way. So a critique of going from risk to uncertainty suggests a different type of politics that goes beyond that conventional state versus market analysis to one that suggests an alternative politics that are much more distributed, much more decentralized, and much more deliberative in its form. So a politics of uncertainty is all about this, all about socially embedded network learning, flexibility, adaptation, innovation. What is the politics that can foster that? And it's often centered on what people have called a politics of care and a politics of conviviality, which can potentially be more open, more democratic, more inclusive, more collective, and then offering multiple pathways for the future rather than a singular vision of one. Now, of course, all of this has similarities to earlier arguments. I don't have to say it to an audience in Germany that there were many German sociologists in the 1980s talking about risk, Ulrich Beck, Niklas Luhmann, and others, who all argued for a new politics in the face of systemic risks arising in late industrial societies. They termed it risk, but in fact they were largely talking about what I call uncertainty and ignorance. It echoes the arguments of American pragmatist philosophers such as John Dewey or Richard Rorty, who argue that we must grasp what works through practical reasoning, creating what is useful, tangible, with imagination, courage, virtue, and so on. So these are not new arguments, but I think over the last few decades, a recognition of uncertainty has emerged. And the fact that there's a Center for Uncertainty Studies is one reflection of this. And this has emerged from a deeper understanding of what the uncertainty paradigm entails. And it comes from a range of disciplines and across very different experiences. So in contrast to some of the rather glib uses of terms like polycrisis, a discourse that I think has become overused and quickly appropriated, this wider body of work focuses particularly on the politics of knowledge, emerging from intersecting uncertainties. And like uncertainty, crises are always constructed. They're out there, as it were, in nature. So all this has in turn, I think, fostered an important reimagining, still emergent, of a narrow modernist vision of economic progress, sustainability, development more generally, based on risk, fixity, stability, optimality, control. And it moves us increasingly towards a new paradigm of uncertainty, with new relationships, with accredited expertise, a new politics of responsibility, accountability, and democracy, as I've talked about already. So why do we need to argue for this shift, to escape the risk paradigm? The practice of development and economic development more broadly, and indeed so much so-called sustainable development, and more broadly economic policy, humanitarian disaster response, organizational systems, and so much more that I've already mentioned, are, I think, still trapped in a risk paradigm with this dominant vision of modernity constructed through a paradigm of control, whether from a statist perspective or a neoliberal perspective. And the problem is, it really doesn't work. The challenge then, I think, is to break free, to reimagine, to decolonize, if you will, and rethink radically. So, as I've said already, the good news is that there are lots of contemporary experiences to draw from, and I've tried to collate some of these in the chapters of the book. we can seek inspiration from other cultures, other settings, and from just looking beyond the formal to the informal. But we can also look into the past, into other periods where there have been other forms of thinking that can help us get out of this modernist trap that I think we're stuck in. So this is a recasting, what Hannah Arendt long ago called letting go of the banister, releasing us from the confines of current thinking and practice. So where can we seek some inspiration? Well, I've already mentioned the variety of different people who appear in the book who live with and indeed from uncertainty. Yes, these are pastoralists and small-scale farmers, delta dwellers, fishers, swidden cultivators, and so on. But they're also frontline health workers, control room engineers, disaster relief agency personnel on the ground, and many, many more, all grappling with and navigating uncertainty in different ways. Second, we can also seek inspiration from our own disciplines and the histories of our own disciplines and the interactions between them, because there's plenty of thinking out there that goes beyond a narrow Newtonian Cartesian view that tends to obscure uncertainty. So economics is an example. The paper that we wrote was mentioned before. But you could take any discipline you like. But economics is so influential in framing policy and has dominated development studies, where the field that I work in for so long, that there are actually many, many strands out there that challenge that narrow neoclassical view, where so-called blackboard proofs and mathematical models of a particular sort and what Milton Friedman long ago called a positive economics dominate. So as we argue in that paper, which was published in World Development and was illustrated in this rather fabulous comic by a colleague of ours based in Brighton, the ideas of Frank Knight, Friedrich von Hayek, John Maynard Keynes, Alfred Shackle, Joan Robinson, and the great Albert Hirschman, amongst many others, also all coming from very different standpoints, of course, they all make the case for taking uncertainty, uncertain knowledges, really seriously. And there are new approaches in the fields of ecological economics, complexity economics, feminist economics, post-Keynesian economics. You can list them. There's a whole variety of heterodox strands. And there are approaches such as decision-making under deep uncertainty that show practically how economic planning need not be constrained by the standard narrow approach. Yet we tend to revert, and certainly in our teaching and training, we tend to revert to the standard risk-based approach. The arrows going to the top left-hand corner are as powerful in universities as they are powerful in the policy domain. So in whatever discipline you choose, and I know there are a lot of disciplines represented in this room, we must ask, how do current frameworks address uncertainty? Do they close down towards risk, or do they open up towards uncertainties? Are there traditions out there that might help us in recasting the way narrow disciplinary perspectives might be reimagined? Third source of inspiration is to think perhaps more broadly about how we understand change and how we understand complexity and change. And this is influenced by underlying philosophical assumptions about how we see the world. Now, of course, the linear, stagist, evolutionary view is very popular in the West and in my field. Walt Rostow from the 1960s and ideas of linear development and modernization and so on dominated the field. And I could give many other examples. But there was a nice book written back in the 1990s called Doctrines of Development that didn't take that as the standard approach and looked back at other sources of thinking around development. Back to the 19th century, Auguste Comte, for example, highlighted how change should be thought of as much more cyclical, regenerative, divergent paths being created. And this is, of course, reflected in literatures of the time. 18th, 19th century literature in Europe and North America themes of crisis, of hazard, of fortune, of speculation, of risk, central to the novels of Mary Shelley, Henry James, James Conrad, Gustav Flaubert, and many others. So rethinking our philosophical standpoints in ways that can embrace uncertainty requires us to cast our gaze more broadly, think about other philosophical traditions, draw on arts and culture and literatures, not necessarily from Europe and North America, but more broadly, in ways that can help us rethink. And finally, beyond this sort of Western intellectual canon that we've been talking about so far, we can see that there are very diverse religious and cultural views that suggest that uncertainty is rather central to the way life and being exists. And it's reflected in religion, in literature, in poetry, in art, things that reflect that talk about impermanence, about renewal, about plurality, whether this is Buddhism, Hinduism, diverse African religions, and of course, a variety of Christian scriptures and beliefs. So, to conclude, the book argues it's possible to release ourselves from the confines and strictures of a narrow, risk-based vision, to transform ourselves from the risk-based paradigm to the uncertainty paradigm, from control to care. And as the world grapples with unprecedented turbulence and diverse uncertainties, it's important to seek out these diverse inspirations that I talked about, actively resurface, reclaim these ideas if pathways to sustainable and successful and flourishing futures are to be generated. Rebecca Solnit, an author I really love, argued in an essay earlier this year, and this is a quote from her, not me, that rather than following the cheerleaders of despair, a more hopeful vision can be offered. And uncertainty provides a route into that. What motivates us, she says, to act is a sense of possibility within uncertainty, that the outcome is not yet fully determined, that our actions may matter in shaping it. If we can recognize that we don't know what will happen, that the future does not yet exist, but is being made in the present, then we can be moved to participate in making that future. So this is the radical, hopeful rethinking that I try and lay out in the book that I think is required for us to navigate uncertainty. So that's the end of the talk. Do read the book.